So, China and Europe have been going through a rough patch lately, and it's over electric cars. Chinese production of electric cars has taken off in recent years, and they're cheap. To put that into perspective, in China you can buy an electric car for 12k USD or just under 1100 euros, compared to Europe's cheapest model at 18.5k in dollars or 16.6k in euros. And in the US, an electric car will still run you about 30k at the minimum. With the North American market effectively closed to Chinese electric vehicles or EVs, both the US and Canada impose a whopping 100% tariff on imports. China is eager to ensure that they can at least sell their EVs in Europe. But now the EU is considering its own tax. The proposed tariffs would tax Chinese EVs up to 35% to counter the government subsidies that allow Chinese companies to sell their cars at such extremely low prices. Which is a thing. Chinese EVs are heavily subsidized by the government, which means they can sell them for a price way lower than any European firm would be able to. There's a good reason to worry that it would be impossible for European EVs to compete, and that Chinese models would quickly swallow up a majority of the market share in Europe. Basically, this could get really bad for Europe. However, if the EU does pass these tariffs, the CCP has its own reasons to be concerned. All the existing problems in the EU-China relationship have only gotten worse since the beginning of the year, which you'd think we'd all realize that getting into a relationship does not make your reconcilable differences go away. If she's a shopaholic, I promise you that problem will not get better just because you're married, but both of you are on that credit card. Whatever, here we are. 2023 ended on a good note with China announcing new visa-free travel for European countries. Not that this was something Europe particularly cared about, but it was a nice gesture, I guess. Since the beginning of 2024, we've had some EU infighting about Chinese EVs, something that famously never happens, and about the European approach to China in general. At the time, the four largest camps were: we shouldn't have trade restrictions in a free market, from Germany mostly; we shouldn't just follow the US on China, France mostly; why is the EU Commission deciding stuff for us? Most countries were here at the beginning of 2024, and why are we spending time and money on this? Countries with no stake in the auto industry. China went for appeasement, giving some nice gifts to the Spanish, Irish, and Belgians in March. However, they gave in on nothing that really mattered, like data flow, their export of subsidized goods, and continued implicit support of Russia. Meanwhile, France and Germany continued to fumble. Germany continued to not want to do anything to provoke Beijing, and by June, the French 1-2 political punch took the spotlight off China for a few months, what with the snap election and everyone doing their best to make sure Macron caught E. coli in the Seine. Even with all this fumbling, by September, it seems like the EU could agree on one thing: the stance Europe needs to take towards China is risk management. It's been translating that into policy that everyone can agree on that's been the hard part. By now, the squabbling has narrowed down to three camps. 1. For a variety of reasons, the EU Commission has been able to consolidate support. Von der Leyen's emphasis on rebooting Europe's China policy with an economic focus to align with the incoming American admin, whichever that ends up being. 2. France's stance is that Europe shouldn't just fall into line behind the US, and that more generally, EU relations with the US should not affect EU relations with China. Although this is a difference in broader strategy, more immediately, Macron has been vocally supporting the EU Commission in regard to the EV tariffs. Lastly, Germany seems equally terrified by either approach, but mostly by the idea of their car makers being shut out of the Chinese market. BMW, Mercedes-Benz, and Volkswagen remain heavily dependent on China's market, even as they're slipping due to competition from Chinese brands. It's because of this that it's Germany that China has been most successful with, although Spain recently joined Germany in advocating against the tariffs, which is likely what postponed the EV tariff vote initially planned for the 25th. In the meantime, China's commerce minister has been running the rounds in Europe. Although given Xi's language, in my opinion, it's very unlikely he makes a new offer that would satisfy Europe's concerns. To be completely transparent, I think the bloc should be backing the Commission's tariffs. But Euro-on-Euro violence isn't what I want to talk about. What's more interesting to me is the skin the CCP has in this, because it wants to stop these tariffs from happening. Bad. To understand why, we have to take a closer look at the Chinese companies that produce these cars and understand why they're so critical to the CCP's economic and political agenda. The majority of these Chinese car manufacturers are not private firms, but state-owned enterprises, SOEs, which have a long history in communist China. A lot of what I'm going to talk about comes straight out of Chapter 4 of the Third Revolution, which, while now a bit outdated, I think overall holds up in its analysis of China's economic behavior. In the Mao era, SOEs were initially founded as a kind of big brother to the Chinese working class, and a job at one was considered an iron rice bowl job because it essentially guaranteed employment for life. It's because of their status as part of the flagship of the Chinese socialist system that despite their low productivity, overemployment, and consumption of prime resources, SOEs have been extremely hard for the CCP to reform. The first major reform was in 1984, when SOEs began to sell their excess production for up to 20% more than the official price. In the early 90s, weak competitiveness sparked a wave of reform, with SOEs now being leased or sold to the Chinese public or employees. This culminated in the 1993 company law allowing SOEs to incorporate with a corporate board and establish joint stock companies. But the most significant SOE reform, and the one with the greatest hold over the Chinese public, was from the mid-90s to the early aughts, when grasping the large, letting go of the small policy under Jiang Zemin resulted in the CCP allowing smaller, less profitable SOEs to privatize, with the state keeping the larger firms. As a result, employment in the SOE sector dropped by almost half, from 70 million in 1997 to around 37 million in 2005. And remember, these were supposed to be iron rice bowl jobs. The last round of privatization and subsequent unemployment is not remembered well by Chinese. You could see the political taboo of saying, we need to privatize more SOEs in China as being about the equivalent of an American politician saying, we need to move more Midwestern jobs to China. Subsequently, SOE reform never again reached the height of the 90s. During Hu Jintao's time in office, SOEs again rose in importance with increased regulation of privatization. SOEs also received the bulk of the stimulus of the 2009 financial crisis. Partial privatization was the only SOE reform stressed, although this wasn't really popular in the private sector. As Wanda Group chairman and founder Wang Jianlin put it, if I'm going to mix, the private company definitely needs to have a controlling share, or at least I want relative control. If the SOE has a controlling share, isn't that the same as me helping out the SOE by giving it money? Wouldn't that be crazy of me to do? I can't do that kind of thing. So that didn't really work. Another major problem with SOEs is overcapacity. In other words, producing way too much of a product without enough people to buy it. And unlike private companies, SOEs can roll over a lot of the stop signs on the way to production. As the Chinese economy has slowed, overcapacity has become a particularly acute problem. Since SOEs typically do not pay dividends except to the state, and much of those are returned to the SOEs, they use the dividends to expand capacity and keep employment levels up. In the steel sector, for example, in 2015, China had 336 million tons of overcapacity and contributed 46% of the world's overcapacity. It's not like the CCP doesn't know reform is needed. In 2016, although the CCP Minister of Human Resources and Social Security outlined a cut of 1.8 million workers, with officials later suggesting that as many as 5 to 8 million workers might be laid off, the policy quickly changed to SOE mergers and worker transfers rather than layoffs. At the time, labor protests, or mass incidents as the CCP records them, had doubled from 2014 to 2016 to reach 2,663. This lack of political will is a problem because Chinese SOEs have long been holding pens for excess manufacturing labor. Productivity per person at Chalco, which used to be the largest aluminum producer in China, for example, is 1/7 of its private competitor Hongqiao. Since then, it's been more the same, marginal reform rather than the complete overhaul the SOE system needs. We already talked a little bit about labor unrest, but I really want to emphasize the place the 90s SOE layoffs have in the public's memory. In China's northeast, whole cities and provinces still haven't recovered from the loss of these industries, leading to Dongbei now being called China's Rust Belt. These iron rice bowl jobs are still a huge part of Dongbei people's identity, and their loss still has devastating effects in the region decades later. Just to talk a little bit about that collective memory, if anyone's looking for good Chinese drama to watch, The Long Season tells the story of an unsolved murder across 3 different years, 1997, 98, and 2016. And through the eyes of 2 different generations of residents, an older group still reeling from being laid off, and a younger generation who grew up with none of the guarantees taken for granted by their parents. It's not just The Long Season, which was one of the most popular dramas that year. There's actually been a pretty big surge in popular media from Dongbei these past few years. A big reason for this is that the economic instability a lot of Chinese people are experiencing right now has made stories from the region a lot more relatable than they used to be. All this to say that SOE layoffs are a huge cultural memory across China, even for those who weren't in Dongbei or who weren't alive at the time. The CCP's aware of this, which is why SOE reform has so far been incremental. So, this leaves the CCP stuck with these bloated, unproductive zombie companies that will continue to consume prime land and resources, and they can't do anything about it because they're afraid of the public backlash the necessary reforms would cause, right? Yes and no. There's another reason the CCP opposes full privatization of SOEs. By maintaining majority control over them, the CCP can use SOEs to propel their strategic goals. Under the going out strategy of the past 2 decades, the party has used SOEs to meet objectives in areas like resource extraction and infrastructure development. As Xiao Yating wrote in 2017 in an article for the Study Times, the CCP's theoretical journal, SOEs must be the most trustworthy force of the party and a major force for realizing going out and the BRI. One notable example of the way the CCP uses SOEs to achieve a political goal was back in 2009, when it successfully used Chinalco to manipulate the price of iron ore. According to former Rio Tinto executive Michael Komasaroff, there was a pending merger between the Anglo-Australian firms BHP Billiton and Rio Tinto, which would have led to their combined control of 1/3 of the world's iron ore. China was worried that this would result in the price rising 7 to 8 times. China is a huge consumer of coal, and this was even more the case back in 2009. To prevent this, China's NDRC basically held an internal beauty pageant, in the words of Komasaroff, to determine which of the major iron ore SOEs, Shenhua, Chinalco, or Baosteel, would carry the Chinese flag. Chinalco won. The Chinese government provided Chinalco, which was then headed by Xiao Yating, with the money necessary to block the bid. Xiao would spend $14 billion to take a 12% stake in Rio Tinto, leading to BHP Billiton to withdraw. In the end, Chinalco's parent company, Chalco, took a $10 billion loss. Yes, a $10 billion loss. This kind of loss would have destroyed a private firm. But for Chinalco, as an SOE who does not need to turn a profit and was acting on behalf of the interests of the state, it was a success. As Komasaroff argues, China's national interests paid off. For Xi Jinping, the upside of accepting less than optimal technologies and market efficiencies in the short term is made up by the long-term ability of the country to use its advantages in labor cost and market size to dominate these industries in the future. And so far, this trade-off, keeping SOEs under government control, however bloated and unprofitable to meet economic and strategic goals, has mostly worked out. The CCP's heavy investment into key industries had given China a head start, with foreign firms still having to figure out how to make these technologies profitable first. But EVs might just be the biggest test of this strategy yet. Next year, the CCP has an important deadline, Made in China 2025. This initiative began in 2015 and identified 10 priority sectors for the Chinese economy, one of them being EVs. By 2025, the goal was to raise domestic content for these key industries to 70%, although the CCP already missed the midway goal of 40% in 2020, which, not surprisingly, went unacknowledged. But what if, when the Made in China 2025 deadline is up at next year's 5th plenary session, a time when the party wants to celebrate progress in these sectors, it's instead off the back of another round of tariffs and layoffs in these key industries? Having already missed the 2020 benchmark and with the looming threat of EU tariffs, this is a possibility that is seeming more and more likely. A significant part of the Made in 2025 strategy has been pouring government funding into domestic production of these key sectors, which has distorted the Chinese domestic market and prevented equal competition with foreign firms. At the same time, the CCP is working to export products such as Chinese EVs to make themselves a key global player in these industries. These proposed tariffs, by the way, range from 7.8% to 35.3% and are meant to cancel out subsidies the Chinese government has lavished on its electric vehicle market. With the pressure on, it's no wonder Wang Wentao has been running around Europe. To be completely honest, Europe needs to get its act together. Compared to China and the US, none of these individual EU countries really have any political weight unless they act as a bloc. This is what China thinks too, by the way, which is why they're working so hard to court countries individually. This EV vote is gonna set the tone for Europe's China strategy, and China is paying close attention.